It's good to see you today. Appreciate you tuning in for a little bit of our daily bread. We're going to be thinking about David today. Talking about King David, the man after God's own heart. And we're not going to read any scripture today. And I hate to do that, but we're just going to, I hope you're familiar with David's life. I just want you to think about, we're going to talk about four people that were in David's life. We know so much about David's life that if we started reading scripture about each one of these four individuals, this video might be longer than just a little bit of our daily bread. It might be a lot of our daily bread, but as it is. I want you to just think about four individuals and what we can learn from David's interaction with him. I want you to begin by thinking about David and Saul. Saul was the king who preceded David. And one of the things we see within how David treated Saul. And it is a great lesson in respecting authority. David had the opportunity multiple times to harm Saul. And David had been chosen to be the next king. But as that transitional time was happening, David would not harm God's anointed in thinking about Saul. And it just becomes a great lesson to us. Just think about political vitriol today and think about how David treated Saul and see if there's not a lesson there in thinking about how we treat those who frankly are ungodly. And that's what Saul was. Saul had sinned, and the kingdom was being taken away from him, being ripped away from him, and it was being given to David. And David frankly knew it, but at this time, David refused to harm King Saul. And to hear how he speaks about King Saul is interesting, and it is a great lesson for us in thinking about respecting authority, honoring the king, giving honor to whom honor is due, and being civil along those lines. Just think about David and King Saul and see if there's not a lesson for us today. You might also think about David and Jonathan. That's the second person. Jonathan was Saul's son. And within David and Jonathan, we see the power of a wonderful friendship. Scripture says there is a friend that is closer than a brother. We need good friends in our lives. And we know what Scripture says. As iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens the counsel of his friend, right? So a friend sharpens his friend, or along those lines, pardon me. But those are the sort of friends that we need in our lives. Within David and Jonathan, as much trouble because Saul ends up, even though David respected Saul, Saul didn't exactly respect David. He tries to kill him multiple times, and Jonathan actually keeps that from happening. And David and Jonathan were they're as close as you could be. They're as close as you could be, and they were godly together. They were godly together, and they were good friends. Those are the sorts of friends that we need in our lives, and those are the sorts of friends that we need to be. We need to be like them. We need to be that sort of a friend to those around us, right? That's what we need to be. To think about drawing others closer to God. Jonathan knew what was happening. You might think about the humility of Jonathan. Jonathan knew what was happening as the kingdom was being taken from his father and given to another. And David, even after Jonathan's death, David is going to do kindness to Jonathan's family. That's the account of Mephibosheth. So talk about that as well, as far as remembering and honoring and all those things. But just think about David and Jonathan, and think about the power of good friends and godly friends. Then you have to, whenever you think about David, you have to think about David and Bathsheba. So some points within that are, we need to learn to be content with what we have. David was a married man, and he needed to be content with what he had. and he wasn't. And thus you have the account of David and Bathsheba. You probably also ought to think about sin and trying to hide sin. That's what David tried to do. He tried to hide it. God calls him out on it, and God's going to end up, as he says, you've hidden this thing, I'm going to do it in front of all of Israel. Everyone's going to know about it. But don't try to hide sin. You might also think about what David lost because of his sin. He lost his son. His son died. But when you really back up and think about it, the account is also about mercy, because David deserved to die. So what you have happening is you have someone who did not deserve to die, dying, his son, and you have someone who did deserve to die, not die, David. So someone else died, but the one who deserved it did not. Hopefully you start seeing the lesson for us within David and Bathsheba as you think about mercy. You might think about how even the man after God's own heart depended upon mercy because he deserved to be put to death. By law, by God's law, he should have been put to death. But God was merciful. That's what David depended on. That's what we depend on as well. It's David and Bathsheba. The fourth one is David and Absalom. Now, what would you say about David and Absalom? Absalom was another of David's sons. You might think about sometimes the problems that we face in life. Sometimes they come from family. Some of the most difficult situations that we may face in life problems may arise within our families. And it's not good. It may be our children, it may be our brothers and sisters, it may be our parents, but people are not doing what they should be doing, and we're going to be faced with hard choices in how to deal with them. That's David and Absalom. Another point we could make about David and Absalom is there was nothing that David could do. Absalom went down this road regardless of what anybody tried to say, and Absalom ends up dying. There was nothing that David could do. I assure you, David probably did everything he could to try to get his boy turned around, and it just didn't work. It wasn't David's fault, it was Absalom's fault. Okay? And the lesson is, sometimes there's just nothing you can do. You got to let him go. Sometimes you have to let him go. And that's David and Absalom. And David wasn't happy about it. When he heard about Absalom's death, he mourned. He just mourned. There wasn't anything he could do, though. He had to let him go. And that's another lesson for us that we learn from the account of David. You might think about these four individuals. Like I said, there are other individuals we could have talked about, certainly. But I thought these four made a pretty good list. So, appreciate you being with us today. Hope you have a good day. Hope you tune in tomorrow for another little bit of our daily bread. Thanks for being with us.